Chapter 17.
"I think it is time,"
said Merlin, looking at him over the top of his spectacles one afternoon,
"that you had another dose of education. That is, as time goes."
It was an afternoon in early spring, and everything outside the window looked most beautiful. The winter mantle had gone, taking with it Sir Grummore, Master Twitty, King Pellinore, and the questing beast, the latter having revived under the influence of kindliness and bread and milk. It had bounded off into the snow with every sign of gratitude, to be followed 2 hours later by the excited king, and the watchers from the battlement had observed it confusing its snowy footprints most ingeniously as it reached the edge of the chase. It was running backwards, bounding 20 foot sideways, rubbing out its marks with its tail, climbing along horizontal branches, and performing many other tricks with evident enjoyment. They had also seen King Pellinore, who had dutifully kept his eyes shut and counted 10,000 while this was going on, becoming quite confused when he arrived at the difficult spot, and finally galloping off in the wrong direction with his brachet trailing behind him. It was a lovely afternoon. Outside the schoolroom window, the larches of the distant forest had already assumed the fullness of their dazzling green. The earth twinkled and swelled with a million drops, and every bird in the world had come home to court and sing. The village folk were forth in their gardens every evening, planting garden beans, and it seemed that, what with these emergencies and those of the slugs, coincidentally with the beans, the buds, the lambs, and the birds, every living thing had conspired to come out.
"What would you like it to be?"
asked Merlin. Wart looked out of the window, listening to the thrush's twice done song of dew. He said, "I have been a bird once, but it was only in the mews at night, and I never got a chance to fly. Even if one ought not to do one's education twice, don't you think I could be a bird so as to learn about that?" He had been bitten with the craze for birds which bites all sensible people in the spring, and which sometimes even leads to such excesses as birds' nesting, etc.
"I can see no reason why you shouldn't," said the magician. "Why not try it at night?"
"But they will all be asleep at night."
"All the better chance of inspecting them without their flying away. You could go with Archimedes this evening, and he would tell you about them."
"Would you do that, Archimedes?" "I should love to," said the owl. "I was feeling like a little saunter myself." "Do you know," asked the wart, thinking of the thrush, "why birds sing, or how? Is it a language?" "Of course it's a language. It isn't a big language like human speech, but it's large."
"Gilbert White," said Merlin, "remarks, or will remark, however you like to put it, that the language of birds is very ancient, and like other ancient modes of speech, little is said, but much is intended. He also says somewhere that the rooks in the breeding season attempt sometimes, in the gaiety of their hearts, to sing, but with no great success."
"I love rooks," said the wart. "It's funny, but I think they are my favorite bird." "Why?" asked Archimedes. "Well, I like them. I like their sauce."
"Neglectful parents," quoted
Merlin, who was in a scholarly mood,
"and saucy, perverse children."
"It is true," said Archimedes reflectively, "that all the Corvidae possesses a distorted sense of humor." Wart explained, "I love the way they enjoy flying. They don't just fly like other birds. but they fly for fun. It is lovely when they hoist home to bed in a flock at night, all cheering and making rude remarks and pouncing on each other in a vulgar way. They turn over on the back sometimes and tumble out of the air, just to be ridiculous, or else because they have forgotten that they are flying and have coarsely begun to scratch themselves for fleas without thinking about it. They are intelligent birds, said Archimedes. In spite of their low humor, they are one of the birds that have parliaments, you know, and a social system. Do you mean that they have laws? Certainly they have laws. They meet in the autumn in a field to talk them over. What sort of laws? Oh, well, laws about the defense of the rookery and marriage and so forth. You are not allowed to marry outside the rookery, and if you do become quite lost to all sense of decency and bring back a sable virgin from a neighboring settlement, then everybody pulls your nest to pieces as fast as you can build it up. They make you go into the suburbs, you know, and that is why every rookery has outlying nests all round it, several trees away. Another thing I like about them, said the wart, is their go. They may be thieves and practical jokers, and they do quarrel and bully each other in a squawky way, but they have got the courage to mob their enemies. I should think it takes some courage to mob a hawk, even if there is a pack of you, and even while they are doing it, they clown. They are mobs, said Archimedes loftily. You have said the word. Well, they are larky mobs, anyway, said the wart, and I like them. What is your favorite bird? Asked Merlin politely, to keep the peace. Archimedes thought this over for some time, then said, well, it's a large question, you know. It's rather like asking you what's your favorite book. On the whole, however, I think that I must prefer the pigeon. To eat? I was leaving that side of it out, said the owl in civilized tones. Actually, the pigeon is the favorite dish of all raptors, if they are big enough to take her, but I was thinking of nothing but domestic habits. Describe them. The pigeon, said Archimedes, is a kind of Quaker. She dresses in gray, a dutiful child, a constant lover, and a wise parent. She knows, like all philosophers, that the hand of every man is against her. She has learned throughout the centuries to specialize in escape. No pigeon has ever committed an act of aggression, nor turned upon her persecutors, but no bird, likewise, is so skillful in eluding them. She has learned to drop out of a tree on the opposite side to man, and to fly so that there is a hedge between them. No other bird can estimate a range so well. Vigilant, powdery, odorous, and loose-feathered, so that dogs object to take them in their mouths, armored against pellets by the closeness of these feathers, the pigeons coo to one another with true love, nourish their cunningly hidden children with true solicitude, and flee from the aggressor with true philosophy, a race of peace lovers continually caravanning away from the destructive Indian in covered wagons. They are loving individualists, surviving against the forces of massacre only by wisdom in escape. Did you know, added Archimedes, that a pair of pigeons always roost head to tail, so that they can keep a lookout in both directions? I know that our tame pigeons do, said the wart. What I like about wood pigeons is the clap of their wings, and how they soar up and close their wings and sink during their courting flights, so that they fly rather like woodpeckers. It isn't very like woodpeckers, said Merlin. No, it isn't, admitted the wart. And what is your favorite bird? Asked Archimedes, feeling that his master ought to be allowed to say. Merlin put his fingers together like Sherlock Holmes and replied immediately,
I prefer the chaffinch. My friend Linnaeus calls him Coleb, or bachelor bird. The flocks have the sense of the flocks have the sense to separate during the winter, so that all the males are in one flock and all the females in the other. For the winter months, at any rate, there is perfect peace.
The conversation, observed Archimedes, arose out of whether birds could talk. Another friend of mine, said Merlin immediately, in his most learned voice, maintains or will maintain that the questions of the language of birds arises out of imitation. Aristotle, you know, also attributes tragedy to imitation. Archimedes sighed heavily and remarked in prophetic tones, You had better get it off your chest.
It's like this, said Merlin. The kestrel drops upon a mouse, and the poor mouse, transfixed with those needle talons, cries out in agony his one squeal of kee. Next time the kestrel sees a mouse, his own soul cries out kee in imitation. Another kestrel, perhaps his mate, comes to that cry, and after a few million years, all the kestrels are calling each other with their individual note of kee, kee, kee.
You can't make the whole story out of one bird, said the wart.
I don't want to. The hawks scream like their prey, the mallards croak like the frogs they eat, the shrikes also, like those creatures in distress, the blackbirds and thrushes click like the snail shells they hammer to pieces, the various finches make the noise of cracking their seeds, and the woodpecker imitates the tapping on wood which he makes to get the insects that he eats.
But all birds do not give a single note.
No, of course not. The call note arises out of imitation, and then the various bird songs are developed by repeating the single call note and descanting upon it.
I see, said Archimedes coldly. And what about me?
Well, you know quite well, said Merlin, that the shrew mouse you pounce upon squeals out, "Squeak!" That is why the young of your species call kiwi.
And the old? Inquired Archimedes sarcastically.
Hurroo! Hurroo!
Cried Merlin, refusing to be damped.
It's obvious, my dear fellow. After the first winter, that's the wind in the hollow trees where they prefer to sleep.
I see, said Archimedes, more coolly than ever. This time, we note, it is not a question of prey at all.
Oh, come along, replied Merlin. There are other things besides the things you eat. Even a bird drinks sometimes, for instance, or bathes itself in water. It is the liquid notes of a river that we hear in a robin's song.
It seems now, said Archimedes, that it is no longer a question of what we eat, but also of what we drink or hear.
And why not?
The owl said resignedly. Oh, well, I think it is an interesting idea, said the wart, to encourage his tutor. But how does a language come out of these imitations?
They repeat them at first, said Merlin, and then they vary them. You don't seem to realize what a lot of meaning there resides in the tone and in the speed of voice. Suppose I were to say, "What a nice day," just like that, you would answer, yes, so it is. But if I were to say, what a nice day, in caressing tones, you might think I was a nice person. But then again, if I were to say, what a nice day, quite breathless, you might look about you to see what had put me in a fright. It is like this that the birds have developed their language.
Would you mind telling us, said Archimedes, since you know so much about it, how many various things we birds are able to express by altering the tempo and emphasis of the elaborations of our call notes?
But a large number of things. You can cry "Kee-wick" in tender accents if you are in love, or "Kee-wick" angrily in challenge or in hate. You can cry it on a rising scale as a call note if you don't know where your partner is, or to attract their attention away if strangers are straying near your nest. If you go near the old nest in the winter time, you may cry "Kee-wick" lovingly, a conditioned reflex from the pleasures which you once enjoyed within it. And if I come near to you in a startling way, you may cry out "Kee-wick, kee-wick, kee-wick" in loud alarm.
When we come to conditioned reflexes, remarked Archimedes sourly, I prefer to look for a mouse.
So you may, and when you find it, I dare say, you will make another sound characteristic of owls, though not often mentioned in books of ornithology. I refer to the sound or which human beings call smacking of lips.
And what sound is that supposed to imitate?
Obviously, the breaking of mousy bones.
You are a cunning master, said Archimedes admiringly. And as far as a poor owl is concerned, you will just have to get away with it. All I can tell you from my own personal experience is that it is not like that at all. A tit can tell you not only that it is in danger, but what kind of danger it is in. It can say, look out for the cat, or look out for the hawk, or look out for the tawny owl, as plain as A, B, C.
I don't deny it, said Merlin. I am only telling you the beginning of the language. Suppose you try to tell me the song of any single bird which I can't attribute originally to imitation.
The nightjar, said Wart.
The buzzing of the wings of beetles,
replied his tutor at once. The nightingale, cried Archimedes desperately.
Ah,
said Merlin, leaning back in his comfortable chair.
now we are to imitate the soul song of our beloved Proserpine as she stirs to wake in all her liquid self.
True, said the wart softly. Phew, added the owl quietly.
Music,
concluded the necromancer in ecstasy, quite unable to make the smallest beginnings of an imitation.
hello,
said Kay, opening the door of the afternoon schoolroom.
I'm sorry I'm late for the geography lesson. I was trying to get a few small birds with my crossbow. Look, I've killed a thrush.
18. The wart lay awake, as he had been instructed to do. He was to wait until Kay was asleep, and then Archimedes would come for him with Merlin's magic. He lay under the great bearskin and stared out of the window at the stars of spring, no longer frosty and metallic, but as if they had been new-washed and had swollen with the moisture. It was a lovely evening, without rain or cold. The sky between the stars was of the deepest and the fullest velvet. Framed in the thick western window, Aldebaran and Betelgeuse were racing Sirius over the horizon. The hunting dog star looked to his master Orion, who had only just heaved himself above the rim. In at the window came also the unfolding scent of benighted flowers, for the currants, the wild cherries, the plums, and the hawthorn were already in bloom, and no less than 5 nightingales were holding a contest of beauty among the bowery, the looming trees. Wart lay on his back, with his bearskin half off him, and his hands clasped behind his head. It was too beautiful to sleep, too temperate for the rug. He watched out at the stars in a kind of trance. Soon it would be summer again, when he could sleep on the battlements and watch these stars hovering as close as moths above his face, and, in the Milky Way at least, with something of the mothy pollen. They would be at the same time so distant that unutterable thoughts of space and eternity would baffle themselves in his sighing breast, and he would imagine to himself how he was falling upwards, higher and higher amongst them, never reaching, never ending, leaving and losing everything in the tranquil speed of space. He was fast asleep when Archimedes came for him. "Eat this," said Archimedes, and handed him a dead mouse. The ward felt so strange that he took the furry atomy without protest, and popped it into his mouth without any feelings that it was going to be horrid. So he was not surprised when it turned out to be excellent, with a fruity taste like eating a peach with the skin on, though naturally the skin was not so nice as the mouse. "Now we had better fly," said the owl. "Just flip to the window sill here to get accustomed to yourself before we take off." Mort jumped for the sill and automatically gave himself an extra kick with his wings, just as a high jumper swings with his arms. He landed on the sill with rather a thump, as all owls are apt to do, did not stop himself in time, and toppled straight out of the window. "This," he thought to himself cheerfully, "is where I break my neck." It was curious, but he was not taking life at all seriously. He felt the castle walls streaking past him, and the ground in the moat swimming up. He kicked with his wings, and the ground sank again, like water in a leaking well. In a second, that kick of his wings had lost its effect, and the ground was welling up again. He kicked again. It was extraordinarily queer, going forward like this, with the earth ebbing and flowing beneath them, in the utter silence of his down-fringed feathers. "For heaven's sake," panted Archimedes, bobbing up and down in the dark air beside him, "do stop flying like a woodpecker. Anybody would take you for a little owl if the brutes had been invented. What you are doing is to give yourself flying speed with one flick of your wings. You then rise on that flick until you have lost flying speed and begin to stall. Then you give another just as you are beginning to drop out of the air, and do a switchback. It's extremely confusing to keep up with you." "Well," said the wart recklessly, "if I stop doing this, I shall just go bump altogether." "Idiot," said the owl, "waver your wings all the time, like me, instead of doing these solitary bounds." The wart did what he was told, and was surprised to find that the ridiculous earth became stable again, and moved underneath him without tilting in a regular pour. He did not feel himself to be moving at all. "That's better. How curious everything looks," observed the wart with some wonder, now that he had time to look about him. And indeed, the world did look curious. In some ways, the best description of it would be to say that it looked a little like a photographer's negative, for he was seeing one ray beyond the spectrum which is visible to human beings. An infrared camera will take photographs in the dark when we cannot see, and it will also take photographs in daylight. The owls are the same, for it is quite untrue that they can only see at night. They see in the day just as well, only they happen to possess the advantage of seeing pretty well at night also, and so they naturally prefer to do their hunting then, when other creatures are more at their mercy. To the wart, the green trees would have looked whitish in the daytime, as if they were covered with apple blossom, and now, at night, everything had the same kind of different look. It was like flying in a twilight which had reduced everything to shades of the same color, and as in the twilight there was a considerable amount of gloom. "Do you like it?" asked the owl. "I like it very much. Do you know, when I was a fish there were parts of the water which were colder or warmer than other parts, and now it is the same in the air." "The temperature of both," said Archimedes instructively, "depends upon the vegetation of the bottom. Woods or weeds, they make it warm above them." "Well," said the wart, "I can see why reptiles who had given up being fishes decided to become birds. It certainly is fun." "You are beginning to fit things together," remarked Archimedes. "Do you mind if we sit down?" "How does one?" "You must stall. That means you must launch yourself upwards until you lose flying speed, and then, just as you feel yourself beginning to tumble, why, you sit down. Haven't you ever noticed how birds usually fly upwards to perch? They don't come straight down on the branch, but dive below it and then rise. At the top of the rise, they stall and sit down." "But birds land on the ground too. And what about mallards on the water? They can't rise to sit on that." "Well, it's perfectly possible to land on flat things, but more difficult. You have to glide in at stalling speed all the way, and then increase your wind resistance by cupping your wings, dropping your feet, tail, etc. You may have noticed that few birds do it really gracefully. Look how a crow thumps down, and how the mallard splashes. The spoon-winged birds like heron and plover seem to do it best. As a matter of fact, we owls aren't so bad at it ourselves." "And the long-winged birds, like swifts, I suppose they are the worst, for they can't rise from a flat surface at all." "The reasons are different," said Archimedes. "Yet the fact is true. But need we talk on the wing? I'm getting quite tired." "So am I. Owls usually prefer to sit down every few hundred yards." The wart copied Archimedes in zooming up towards the branch which they had selected. He began to fall just as they were about it, clutched it with his furry feet at the last moment, swayed backwards and forwards twice, and found that he had landed successfully. He folded up his wings. While the wart was still admiring the view, his friend proceeded to give him a longish lecture upon flight in birds. He told how, although the swift was so fine a flyer that he could sleep on the wing all night, and although the wart himself had claimed to admire the way in which rooks enjoyed their flights, the real aeronaut of the lower strata, which cut out the swift, was the plover. He explained how plovers indulged in aerobatics, and would actually do such stunts as spins, stall turns, and even rolls for the mere grace of the thing. They were the only birds which made a practice of slipping off heights to land. Wart paid little or no attention to the lecture, but got his eyes accustomed to the strange tones of light instead, and watched Archimedes out of the corner of one of them. For Archimedes, while he was talking, was absent-mindedly spying for his dinner. This spying was an odd performance. You know how a spinning top, which is beginning to lose its spin, slowly describes circles with its highest point before falling down? The leg of the top remains in the same place, but the apex makes circles which get bigger and bigger towards the end. This is what Archimedes was absent-mindedly doing. His feet remained stationary, but he moved the upper part of his body round and round, like somebody trying to see from behind a fat lady at a cinema, and uncertain which side of her gave the best view. As he could also turn his head almost completely round on his shoulders, you may imagine that his antics were worth watching. "What are you doing?" asked the wart. But even as he asked, Archimedes was gone. First, there had been an owl talking about plover, and then there was no owl. Only, far below the wart, there was a thump and a rattle of leaves as the aerial torpedo went smack into the middle of a bush, quite regardless of obstructions. In a minute, the owl was sitting beside him again on the branch, thoughtfully breaking up a dead sparrow. "May I do that?" asked the wart, inclined to be bloodthirsty. "As a matter of fact," said Archimedes, after waiting to crop his mouthful, "you may not. That magic mouse which turned you into an owl will be quite enough for you. After all, you've been eating as a human all day, and no owl kills for pleasure. It simply isn't done. Besides, I am supposed to be taking you for education, and as soon as I have finished my snack here, that is what we shall have to do." "Where are you going to take me?" Archimedes finished his sparrow, wiped his beak politely on the bough, and turned his tender eyes full upon the wart. These great round eyes had, as a famous writer expressed it, a bloom of light upon them, like the purple bloom of powder on a grape. "I am going to take you," said he slowly, "where no human being has ever been, to see my dear mother Athene, the goddess of wisdom." It was a long and terrible journey, passing beyond the midnight country of sorrow and the sun-drained wastes of solitude into the undiscovered country of Kinicuhar, whose latitude is 91 degrees north and longitude 181 degrees west. Here, in the luminous hollow of a tree stump that had been blasted by lightning and whittled clean by the winds of knowledge, they alighted on the outstretched hands of the goddess. Athene was invisible, or at least the wart never remembered having seen her afterwards. At the time he did not notice that she was invisible. It only struck him when he woke up next morning, because he was aware of her without seeing her. He was aware that her unthinkable beauty was neither that of age nor of youth, that her eyes were the only things you thought of looking at, and that to be her was terrible, whereas to be with her was the only joy. If you can understand this, she was in herself so unhappy that words only melt in such temperatures, but towards other people she was the spirit of invincible mercy and protection. She lived, of course, beyond sorrow and solitude, and if you follow me, the suffering which had brought her there had left her with a kind of supernatural good manners. She was the conqueror. Archimedes kissed her tenderly. He was not overawed by her, but saluted her almost with pity, as if he were a man of the world visiting his sister, a nun who did not understand how to get on in his world, or perhaps a prosperous banker who had always tried to be reasonably decent, meeting the man whose destiny it was to be nailed up and left to die of sunstroke, agony, and exhaustion in order to save the prosperous bankers. Even Archimedes did not understand her. She knew this. "Hail, mother," said Archimedes. "I have brought you a young human who is to learn things by decree. When the wart came to think about it afterwards, he realized that he had not only never seen the goddess, but that he had also never heard her speak. The owl spoke, and he spoke, but the words of Athene did not come out of a mouth. "This part," said Archimedes with a sort of purr, "is at the rate of 30 years in a minute. It is one of our owl's dreams, you know, such as we gain our wisdom from in the sighing of a night." Athene did not speak, but she held the wart in the hollow of her kind hand, and he knew that he was to look in front of him. He saw the world with his own eyes now, no longer using the strange spectrum which he had experienced since he came out with Archimedes, and no doubt this was done in order to make things easier for him. They needed to be made easier, for it was now his business to watch a world in which a year passed in 2 seconds. It was a world of trees. "We dream of this," explained Archimedes, "when we perch on a tree in the winds of winter, or sleep in its hollow in the rains of spring. Sometimes nowadays you can see a cinema film of a flower, for instance, in which one exposure has been taken every hour. In it you see the petals expand and throb open or shut for day or night, until the whole story is over and the seeds have been thrown out upon the wind. There was a woodland now in front of the wart, and in it an oak sapling which grew, flourished, and shed its leaves into nakedness, all in the time during which you could slowly count 3. A whole year had passed in that time, with all its human joys and sorrow. "This," said Athene, or at any rate it was what she seemed to be saying in the most glorious of voices, "is called the dream of the trees. People don't think of trees as alive. We never see them moving unless the wind disturbs them, and then it is not their movement but the wind's. The wart saw now the trees are living, and do move. He saw all the forest, like seaweed on the ocean's floor, how the branches rose and groped about and waved, how they panted forth their leaves like breathing, and indeed they were breathing, and what is still more extraordinary, how they talked. If you should be at a cinema when the talking apparatus breaks down, you may have the experience of hearing it start again too slowly. Then you will hear the words, which would be real words, at a proper speed now, droning out unintelligibly in long roars and sighs, which give no meaning to the human brain. The same thing happens with a gramophone, whose disc is not revolving fast. So it is with humans. We cannot hear the trees talking, except as a vague noise of roaring and hushing, which we attribute to the wind and the leaves, because they talk too slowly for us. These noises are really the syllables and vowels of the trees. "You may speak for yourselves," said Athene. Oak spoke first, as became the noblest of all. He stood throbbing, his leaves in the twilight, to which time had mixed down day and night, stretching out his great muscular branches, yawning, as if it were, like a noble giant of the earth who cracks his limbs in the morning when he wakes.
Oh,
Said the oak.
it's good to be alive. Look at my biceps, will you? Do you see how the other trees are afraid of gravity? Afraid that he will break their branches off. They point them up in the air or down at the ground, so as to give the old earth giant his least purchase upon them. Now I am ready to challenge gravity, and I can stretch my branches straight out in a line parallel to the earth. He may swing on them for all I care, but bless you, they won't break. Do you know how long I live? 1,000 years is my expectation. 300 years to grow, 300 years to live, and 300 years to die. And when I am dead, what of that? They make me into timber, into ships, and house beams that will be good for another 1,000. My leaves come the last and go the last. I am a conservative. I am, and out of my apples they make ink, whose words may live as long as me, even as me, the oak.
Ash said softly, I am the Venus of the forest. I'm pliable. My dear madam, said a rather society box in smirking urban scholastic 18th century accents, a decoction of boxwood promotes the growth of hair, while an oil distilled from its shavings is a cure for hemorrhoids, toothache, epilepsy, and stomach worms. So at least we are told. If it comes to being sarcastic, replied a homely Hazel, who was a good fellow at heart, although he was inclined to snap, may I mention that hazel chips will clear turbid wine in 24 hours, and twigs of hazel twisted together will serve for yeast and brewing. You may be a sort of Lord Chesterfield, but at least you will have to yield to me in the matter of genteel, tipsy fiction practiced by the elegant gentlemen of your century. As far as drink goes, said an impossible female ivy, who was always clinging to her husband, putting her oar in and making his life a misery. Ground ivy is used for clarifying beer. She simpered when she said the word beer in the most unpleasant way. She was a sour creature in any light.
I don't know why we are talking about drink,
said a dignified Peach.
but if we are talking about it, I may as well mention that Virgil's drinking bowl, Divini Opus Alcimedontis, was turned out of my wood.
Great men, remarked a close-grained stout lime, are always going back to the trees. Grindling Gibbons would never carve his nets and baskets out of anything but me.
And Salvator Rosa, said a chestnut, was always painting me.
Corot, said a willow sign, was fond of me.
How you humans do spin about, remarked a crafty elm coldly. What a speed they live at. It is rather good sport trying to spot them and then to drop an old bough on their heads if you get them directly underneath. But of course, you have to stand very still and give no signs of dropping it till the actual moment. The cream of the joke is that they make their coffins out of me afterwards. You always were a treacherous fellow, replied an old ewe. What's the point of it? Surely it's better to help than to hinder. Now, Oak here, and a few others of us, we take pride in keeping faith. We like to be steadfast. Everybody prizes me because, like Alder, I scorn to rot in water. My gateposts are more durable than iron, and they do not even rust.
Yes, chimed in some cypresses, sycamores, and others. Live and let live. That's the best motto. We and our sisters are always pleased to see the grass growing under our shade.
On the contrary,
said a fir, who always killed the grass beneath him, and a nervous aspen joined in.
Kill or be killed. That's the way to get on. But please don't talk of killing,
added the aspen.
the cross was made out of me, and I have trembled ever since. I only kill, you know, because I am frightened. It is a terrible thing always to be afraid.
A cedar decided to cheer her up. "Oh, come on," he remarked, twinkling his dusky spines. "What's the point of all this argument and boasting about your powers? Seems to me that you all take life too seriously. Look at my old friend Sequoia here, who has had the humorous idea of constructing himself a very hard-looking bark out of soft blotting paper, so that you can punch him without hurting yourself. If it comes to that, look at me. What is my mission in life? You may think it a humble one, considering my size, but I find it amusing. I am antipathetic to fleas." All the trees laughed at this. It resulted in a splendid summer that year, and decided to go on with their dance. It was a sort of Indian dance, in which they moved their bodies but not their feet, and a very graceful one it was. The wart watched while the whole troop of them rippled their twigs like serpents, or made slow ritual gestures about their heads and bodies with the larger boughs. He saw how they grew big and lusty in their dancing, how they threw their arms out towards heaven in an ecstasy of being alive. The younger trees tired first. The little fruit trees stopped waving, hung their weary heads for a moment, then fell down on the ground. The big ones moved more slowly, faltered and fell one by one, till only Oak was left. He stood with his chin sunk upon his chest, kept upright by his mighty will, thinking of the lovely dance which now was over. He sighed and looked upwards to Athene, stretched out his bare arms sorrowfully to her, to ask her why, and then he also fell asleep. "The next dream," said Athene, "is called the Dream of the Stones." "It is the last dream she will give you," added Archimedes, "and this one goes at 2,000,000 years a second. You will have to keep your eyes skinned." Wart saw a darkness in front of him, with lights in it. The dark was so dark that it was like lamp black, and the lights so light that the coldest blue fire of diamonds could not touch them. The harsh contrast between them made his eyes ache. He was looking at Sirius, actually, just as he had been looking at him a few hours before, but it took him quite a time before he realized that he was looking at a star at all. There was none of the mellow velvet which he had been accustomed to see through the earth's atmosphere, but only this fierce emptiness of black and white. And beside this fact, the constellations were in different positions. It was a few 1,000,000,000 years ago, and all the shapes of the evening have altered since then. The nearest star, which looked the biggest for that reason, burned with a roar of terrible gases, and another star was coming towards it. You could see them surging on their endless paths into eternity, making their aimed but aimless courses across the universe with straight lines of remembered fire, like the meteors with which the Creator sometimes stitched together the weak seams of our dome. The bright darning needles suddenly darted in and out of the velvet by a finger on the other side. As the two stars came closer together, a huge mountain of flame was dragged out by attraction from each. When they were at their closest point, the top of this mountain broke off from the smaller star and streamed through the emptiness towards the bigger. Some of it reached its destination, but the bigger star was proceeding quickly on its way, and some of it was left behind. This part hung in space, lost to both its parents and its seducer, a whirling cigar of fire. Its mists of flame began to crystallize as they cooled, to turn into drops, as water does when it is cooled from steam. The drops took up a circular path of their own, spinning round the star from which they had been dragged. The wart found himself closer to the third drop. Its haze of incandescent worms crawled in and out of it, formed into funnels and whirlpools, crept over its round surface, sometimes leaped out into space, curled over, and rained back. They were flames. The light died down from far beyond white to blue, to red, to a dim brown. It became a ball of steam. Out of this steam, a smaller ball shot out. The first ball shrank and was a globe of boiling water. The water began to cool, but the fire still burned inside it. They convulsed the surface of the water, threw up great continents and islands of the interior rock. The centuries were passing so quickly that even these continents seemed to bubble like porridge as the volcanoes and mountains and earthquakes came and went. The unbridled furnace within was still unstable, and till quite late in the dream, the globe did not always spin on the same axis, but lurched over sideways as some stress gave way inside. The lurches destroyed continents and made more. The wart found himself closer still. He was actually on the globe and facing an enormous cliff. At 2,000,000 years a second, the cliff's mountain moved. It was alive as the trees had been, and roared most dreadfully. It fell, it folded on itself, it shoved itself along the surface of the globe, pushing a bow wave of its own folds for miles. Its great rocks split and powdered, pouring stone torrents into the heaving sea. The sea itself grew tired of the mountain, made it to sink down and to be covered. Another convulsion threw up the remains again, streaming. Round the foot of the chastened mountain there lay its powder and its pebbles, great rocks worn smooth by the sea. The rocks themselves broke and were scattered, the sea always rolling and rolling them together between its hands until the tiny fragments were often as round as their mother had been, the globe. A green scum formed over the sinking mountain, a haze of color which was still sometimes dipped under the water or lifted high above it as the earth undulated. The trees came, but their voices were quite drowned by the slower howling of the mineral world, which twitched through millennia like a dog's skin in sleep. "Hold fast," was what the rocks thundered. "Hold, go here." But all the time they were broken apart, thrown down, and their hold broken. There was nothing to be seen of the mountain except a flat green plain which had some pebbles on it. They were bits of the cliff which he had first watched. The dream, like the one before it, lasted about half an hour. In the last 3 minutes of the dream, some fishes, dragons and such like, ran hurriedly about. A dragon swallowed one of the pebbles, but spat it out. In the ultimate twinkling of an eye, far tinier in time than the last millimeter on a 6-foot rule, there came a man. He split up the one pebble which remained of all that mountain with blows, then made an arrowhead of it, and slew his brother. "Well, wart," said Kay in an exasperated voice, "you want all the rug? And why do you even mutter so? You are snoring too." "I don't snore," replied the wart indignantly. "You do." "I don't." "You do. You snore like a volcano." "I don't." "You do." "I don't. And you snore worse." "No, I don't." "Yes, you do." "How can I snore worse if you don't snore at all?" By the time they had thrashed this out, they were nearly late for breakfast. They dressed hurriedly and ran out into the spring.